Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Oh, that might be it.
Hello.
Sorry for the false start, everyone. My name is Luke Runyon, and I'm the moderator for today's panel. And I am the co-director of the Water Desk, which is a journalism initiative based at CU Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism. I'm also the president of the board for the Society of Environmental Journalists. And just for recording purposes, today is Thursday, April 11th, and it is 3:15 p.m. This is panel number 18012, titled Ensuring a Livable Planet, Journalist Perspectives from Global Reporting. And before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. And one other thing I want to mention is how we are going to take Q&A. So here's how we're going to do the Q&A. At the end of our panel discussion, we're going to reserve that for Q&A. We use a note card system to receive questions from the audience. And at any time in the session, just raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers, Faith, who's out there roaming around, ready to give you a note card. Write your question legibly. If you're a student, please note that in your question on the card. And when you finish, raise your hand, and our producer will come bring it up to me. And I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. So now we're ready to get started with our panel discussion. And I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves, and I'm also going to ask a question to get us started here. So for each of our panelists, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, a little bit about your work background, and your area of focus of your coverage as a journalist. And then answer this question. You know, I really want to start with talking about field reporting, how you go out into the field, and how and what you've seen in communities that have been affected by climate change or other sorts of environmental pressures. what are some of the most surprising or unsettling things that you've seen in your experience lately going out into the field and talking to people affected by these issues? And specific stories are highly encouraged. So we'll get started with Chris, if you want to introduce yourself.
Introduce myself and answer the question?
Yes.
Testing. My name is Chris Lett. I am a freelance journalist and also a visual storyteller. Some feedback there. For the Bureau of Land Management. I go out into all of some of the millions of acres of land that's managed and tell stories for the broader public to understand the mission and aim of the Bureau. I am a fellow here and currently working on a documentary about the impact of overfishing on coastal communities in Ghana. And that was also the basis of my research as a fellow back in 2018-19. And yeah, I'm still pursuing that documentary. It's a feature-length documentary. You can check it out on Instagram, Saviors of Our Seas, and also in hopefully some streaming service of yours very soon. But to answer your question, some of the things that I've seen in the field as of late, specifically when I was in Ghana, was meeting with the fishermen who don't necessarily call climate change. They just call it a change. And it's that attitude that I think is something that we can adopt globally and just think about how we adapt to change in our lives on an interpersonal and personal level, as well as an environmental level, because it's all connected. We look at these things kind of in a vacuum, and we're field reporters and field journalists, but those same problems oftentimes translate in another way, shape, or form in our homeland. And the way that they are tackling the changes that they see, be them man-made or natural occurrences that are devastating their natural resources, is by taking action. A lot of them have found alternative ways to either make money or to sustain their livelihood. However, those alternative ways sometimes go outside of the bounds of the law and also can further degrade the environment. So we have to look at a holistic approach when it comes to facing climate change, not just a quick fix when it comes to climate change, or something that just makes us feel good. Recycling comes to mind when that happens, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Kara?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Kara Fox. I am a journalist, digital producer at CNN International out of London. I primarily report on women's issues and climate, corruption, and geopolitics, and how intertwined they all are. This year, I am a TED Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism, like Chris and my colleagues here, where I'm working on a project looking into the financing behind deep sea mining. And I'm also looking at how extractive industries and climate change disproportionately affect women and girls. To answer your question, unsettling things that we see in the field, one comes to mind in terms of reporting from 2022 that's continuing today. When I was reporting on the brutal murders of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira in the Amazon, in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, they were killed. They were environmental defenders and indigenous experts and journalists who were killed for pursuing stories on illegal fishing. And in that same year, 8,000 people in the Brazilian Amazon were killed, 300 of which, over a time frame that Human Rights Watch has been able to document, were attached to the environmental and land defending movement. These are just people that are trying to live on their land and to use the resources that they have in their land in a sustainable way. And we, that was a few years ago, but that trend has continued in neighboring Colombia as well. We have seen 186 people that were also murdered last year. That's like 46% of the global average of environmental defenders that were murdered. And so we're seeing a lot of these people that are trying to live and protect land subject to violence because of transnational crime. And while perhaps not unsurprising, a very continued unsettling trends that are continuing to happen. One other really quick thing I want to touch on is something that I think is a bit, and we're also seeing this closer to home here. We see extractive industries fueling violence against women and girls in the oil-producing regions. In the Bakken region, over the course of 5 years, the amount of sexual assault against these women, most of them indigenous, rose by 70%. That's DOJ's statistics. So we know that extractive industries are hostile to the communities that people live in. And it doesn't matter if you live in the global south or in the United States or anywhere else, it's affecting everyone. The other thing I very briefly wanted to say was also this disconnect that we have between tech and the environment. I think that these ideas, when I was reporting in Ireland, where I'm normally based, about data centers and the construction of data centers, I think we often forget because of the words that are used around technology, like the cloud, it's this ephemeral thing. But actually, data centers and the things that hold all of our data are extremely energy hungry, and a lot of them really rely on fossil fuels. So being out in the field and talking to people who are really excited about jobs creation from these data centers aren't necessarily thinking about the environmental impact. So thank you. I'll turn it over to someone else.
Thanks, Kara. And I know at some point we'll probably want to talk about undersea mining too, because I know that that's a new area of focus for you.
Sure.
Ishan.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Ishan. I'm a freelance journalist, newly based in Boulder. I'm a current TED Scripts Fellow. I spent most of my career at the satirical news show Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, which had real news there as well. I was part of that. And as a freelancer in New York, I often covered issues related to evictions, but I'm definitely much more of a generalist as well. What I'm looking at this year specifically deals with coastal resiliency and how the federal government, and especially the Army Corps of Engineers, is planning to protect American shorelines. Because for many years, what that meant in practice were like turrets on a beach, like literal coastal defense. And now the agency has to deal with sea level rise and coastal storm risk and inland flooding and all these sort of compound risks that they've never had to deal with before, and that's creating some friction, to say the least. I think one thing I've been sort of surprised about in some of the reporting I've done is often how projects that have a veneer of sort of institutional kind of support, maybe from like the World Bank or the Clinton Global Initiative, often have some level of land expropriation or evictions that occur. So I spent some time in South Africa, Nigeria, and Cambodia looking at sort of this issue as it related to dams and seawalls. And for one project that was sort of transporting water from Lesotho to South Africa that was partially financed by the World Bank, there was a lot of evictions and taking land without compensation. And it was sort of justified in this idea that there's a greater good, that the economic benefits outweighed sort of the small, quote unquote, small social costs that existed, but it definitely still happened, and there wasn't a lot of recourse for people who were evicted. And kind of a similar thing happened for this large seawall project off the coast of Lagos, Nigeria, that was sort of billed as a way to protect the city from sea level rise and some sort of tidal flooding, but instead kind of was a place where people could park their money, and ended up, evicting a lot of people from this one beach. And so I think I maybe shouldn't be surprised about this by now, but I'm sort of continually kind of aware that this happens a lot, and that, when we as journalists think about things that are proposed, projects that have some sort of quote unquote broad economic benefits, we should really drill into the social cost as well.
Great, thanks. Hillary.
Hi, I'm Hillary Rosner. I am on the journalism faculty here. I'm the assistant director of the Center for Environmental Journalism. I spent most of my career writing long-form stories about a whole range of environmental issues, but largely biodiversity and conservation. And I'm finishing work on a book which will be published next year. That's about, it's really about land use change and how that has impacted the way non-human species can move around the planet, and thinking about some solutions for how we can sort of knit the planet back together again so that animals can go where they need to go. And I'm sort of always struck by how relatively little attention land use change gets. So I notice all the time that climate change, really gets like the bulk of the environmental journalism attention, and I'm not saying that it should not or isn't deserving, but I think land use change and the extent to which we have really like reshaped the planet doesn't really get as much attention as it should. And just thinking of a recent field reporting story, I was in Kenya earlier this year reporting on some human-wildlife conflict involving elephants, and we traveled to this really remote area where these giant erosion gullies are opening up in the landscape, and it's really this intersection of a whole bunch of different environmental problems, and it just made me realize that we can't keep thinking about these environmental problems in isolation. So you have this town that is kind of growing, and there are people who their livelihood is from livestock grazing, but as people are increasingly privatizing their land and putting up fences, the areas that are being grazed are being overgrazed. And then you have like these massive erosion issues, which also might be climate change related. And then you have elephants that need to migrate seasonally, whose the corridors available to them are shrinking, and they're coming into increasing conflict with humans, and like the only area that they can go through on this seasonal migration that they've been making for thousands of years goes through these increasingly widening, like just gigantic gullies that you could like drive a truck through. And so you've got, kids who have to go to school who have to cross these gullies. You've got elephants that need to like get their babies through these gullies to get where they need food. And there's no real easy or obvious solution. And so I think it's these kind of like real like intersections of multiple different environmental problems that we need to start figuring out how to deal with.
Great, thanks, Hillary. And one thing I failed to mention that Kara touched on is one thing that knits all of us together as panelists is the TED Scripps Fellowship that's based here at the university. So everyone on the panel is either a past fellow or current fellow, and that fellowship program is based here at the Center for Environmental Journalism and allows fellows to audit courses here at the university. Life-changing experience for me, but that's a whole other panel just talking about how great the fellowship is. And I realized when I was asking for introductions, I didn't totally explain where I'm coming from. So I spent most of my career in public media, covering agriculture, food issues, and then in 2017 pivoted to water issues in the Colorado River Basin, now run the water desk here at the university. And so most of my focus as a journalist has been covering water scarcity and water quality challenges, particularly in the Southwest, mostly in the Colorado River and Rio Grande basins. And I'm constantly fascinated with the kind of push and pull between the state's policymaking and lawmakers and all of the kind of water politics that has shaped the West. So to get a little deeper into the conversation here, some of us are fresh off of a conference in Philadelphia that just happened last week. That's the Society of Environmental Journalists. It took place almost all of last week. And, there's a little bit of kind of gallows humor, I guess, at a conference like that, where you get all of these environmental journalists who come together, who cover, ecosystems and energy and renewable energy and water and, the range of environmental issues, of which there are many challenges, which some of you touched on. And I think that it can be easy for journalists and members of the public to feel like a sense of despair around some of the very challenging things that you guys are going out into the field and addressing with your coverage. How do you combat that? Like, of the injustices or like the ecological degradation that you're seeing, like, how do you go about not feeling a sense of despair when you see some of these very tough challenges that are out there? Chris, do you want to get us started? It seems like you're ready.
Sure, yeah. I laugh. That's one way. Because it's a massive problem, right? We all just mentioned problems that seem insurmountable, and while they probably really are in this lifetime, we are here to kind of sound the bell, be the clarion call for public and massive collective action to happen. I don't want to speak for everybody, but that's what I want my stories to achieve. I want them to achieve some level of moving the needle in the direction of environmental justice, sustainability. So thinking about the things that bring me despair in the stories that I've been covering most recently, I failed to mention earlier one of the most dire situations in the fishing world, specifically in West Africa, is these projects that have kind of the veneer of doing good. For instance, placing monitors on boats to monitor the activity of the fishermen. These are either intergovernmental or government-hired monitors to go on boats and monitor the activities of fishermen and the work going on in their boats. Have gone missing. 2 have gone missing in the last 5 years, and nobody seems to care. Women are selling their bodies for access to fish that are coming back onto the shores so they can find a way to either have some kind of supply to sell and make money. And coming from the world of breaking news, I also used to work at CNN. I would always have to find ways to make sure that I don't get consumed by these stories, because as you produce them, you have to, as a storyteller, literally ingest a broad range of material, which includes a lot of horrible things, and then eke out a little like Play-Doh spaghetti for people to consume, you know, and there's a lot left back in the end of that Play-Doh toy. To continue the metaphor, that you don't consume and you don't get to deal with and you don't get to dialogue about until you get on panels like this or in the company. That's why fellowships like this are so great, because we can all talk about our mess that we don't get to produce stories about. But yoga is one thing that I've always gone back to. I know it's kind of trite in Boulder, right? But it really is. I found my center a long time ago when I played American football and got injured and hurt my spine, and I started doing yoga then. And so 20 years later, I found out that yoga can also heal my mind. After dealing with being attacked by terrorists on the job, I had to find a way to make sure that I secured my peace in any situation and instance. And so breath work, yoga, calling my power back into myself. I know it's all woo-woo to some people, but it really helps. Thank you.
Kara, how about you? I mean, that sounded like so many dark stories that you're pursuing. How do you grapple with that when you're doing it?
Oh, it's so dark. No, but I would echo what Chris has to say about, obviously the reason that we all get into this is because we are interested in being a part of like change or changing things or informing people that might be interested in changing things. And for me, the real life impact of what storytelling or bringing certain stories or giving people that don't necessarily have a larger platform to light, as cliche and cheesy as it sounds, is really what keeps me going. Some of my reporting has been brought to Congress and brought to Irish Oireachtas, which is our Congress there, and has had actual impact on people's lives who were struggling to stay in a country that they were working in during COVID and paying their taxes or doing all the things that that they were allowed and supposed to do, or working with opposition leaders in countries that are authoritarian and having being a person non grata in that certain country, but then also seeing that this person was released from jail from the pressure that this reporting did. So, these are, or like reporting on war crimes that actually get, seen in The Hague. Like these are things that matter, and we are here to document and allow people to, change makers to be a part of the change, but also to document so that people that have power and agency to put changes in place to actually actualize that. So yeah, for me, it's about real life impact of reporting on those stories. I actually do find environmental reporting some of the most bleak reporting that there is out there, outside of like conflict and war and all those other things, because we don't have all of those other things without our Earth. So how to sort of reconcile some of the gloom and despair that folks might have around what's currently happening on this planet is a challenge. But yeah, I think things can change too.
Yeah. Ishan?
Yeah, I think kind of echoing what Kara said, that I feel like we're always kind of holding out hope that the thing you write or the audio or the video you make, sort of, instead of being shouted into the void, like the right person listens to it and then brings it up at sort of the right opportune moment. And so I think I'm sort of always kind of struck about how bad government watchdog groups or agencies can be, and then it's up to sort of journalists to bring those stories to light, and then kind of help like make the case for a legislative fix or something. And I'm thinking about, I did some reporting over the last 2 years about like illegal evictions in the city, and New York's human rights agency that was really understaffed. And there was like a hearing 2 weeks ago, and it was like half of it was about some of the specific stories and statistics that me and my editor kind of worked on, and you're always kind of like pumping your fist after that, but you just literally never know if that's going to happen or not. And even the tantalizing promise of it is like enough to keep me going for a little bit. And I will say, I worked at a comedy show for lots of years, and that was actually a really effective way, I think, to channel like rage and anger into sort of like a compelling story that could potentially be listened or heard by a policymaker, who might have some power to change things.
I know. I always think of Samantha Bee in that way, of like channeling rage and comedy in the same breath. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, she was really good at that. So I always found that sort of cathartic as well.
Hillary?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one, I think, the psychology of environmental journalism is rough. It's something I think that everyone should be talking about. It's hard to go out and report on all these things, and it's hard to see all this stuff and see things sometimes getting worse and still try to maintain a positive attitude. I am always blown away, and one of the things that keeps me going is just the people on the ground who are trying so hard, like championing a species, championing a place. Like nothing gets done without champions. And so I have tried to focus my writing on some of those champions, because it's just amazing to see like how passionate people are and how much one passionate person can actually get done. So that's definitely something that's kept me going throughout the reporting of this book, which was definitely depressing in parts. Having said that, I will also say that it's hard sometimes, because I'm constantly pointing things out to like my family and people at parties and whatever. I'm like the one that nobody wants to talk to, because I'm just going to tell like, the doom and gloom statistic. My husband, who's sitting right here, I'm sure would love to agree with me. But I also feel like there's something really important about bearing witness, and that's kind of what I come back to in my work. Like my role is to bear witness, and even if I can't make the change happen that I would like to see, at least I know that I have been sort of documenting some part of what's going on.
Yeah, they always say journalists make good dinner party guests, but you got to keep it light
not
sometimes too.
environmental
I want to ask a little bit, some of you have kind of touched on just like the arc of progress or change that you've seen on your particular beat or coverage area since you've been at it. Like, some of you have mentioned like legislative change, things that have been going on maybe in the public consciousness, but where have you seen real progress being made on the issues that you're covering? Hillary, do you want to start us on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at this for a really crazy long time, embarrassingly enough at this point. But I started writing about climate change back in the day when there was a lot of publications wrote about climate change as though it was something that was not agreed upon, so they would have like a scientist saying like, oh, climate change is happening, and then they would have a congressman with no background in science saying, no, it's not. And there was this kind of he said, she said type of journalism, which you do not see anymore and have not seen for a long time. And to me, like, even just that is a tremendous amount of progress. Did it come fast enough? Probably not. But I think, there really is, like, it's something that is now understood to be happening. There is consensus, like, it's seeped into reporting on, every other beat that there is, and that is, progress, even though it was maybe slow coming.
Anyone else? Ishan?
Yeah, I'm sort of new to the kind of coastal resiliency beat, but I will say that in sort of a lot of the interviews and kind of documents and reporting I've looked at, when Superstorm Sandy hit New York in 2012, like, there was not kind of broad agreement about what should come next. The city was really trying to figure it out as it went, like figure out a buyout strategy, figure out what infrastructure came, next, and then figure out how the Army Corps can kind of build this kind of grand plan to protect the city. And the history of large infrastructure projects in New York is not, great when it comes to community engagement. I'm thinking specifically of Robert Moses and a lot of the kind of waterfront development and sort of highway development that kind of cut through neighborhoods and kind of cut them in half. And in the time, in the 12 years since Sandy, there have been a lot of community advocates who have pushed against the idea that there's a top-down approach to protecting New York, and they've had some recent successes. It's very slow going, but it's been kind of heartening to read about and hear about. To think that a $60 billion investment in the city can be kind of designed by a couple people in the room seems silly, and they've really pushed for like really broad community engagement. So, we'll still see what happens as a result of that, but that seems like some, measure of progress instead of just kind of rushing a thing through the door.
Kara?
I'm going to take it to the state of journalism for any of the J-School people out there, or even folks that are just kind of interested in learning more about what we do. And I think one thing that I've been really excited about is collaborative journalism. So like, I know there's still very much this world where like people are really trying to get an exclusive, but I think this idea of gatekeeping the information needs to just be shut down, right? So there's been a lot of work by a bunch of really fantastic organizations, like the ICIJ is a really great one, where instead of journalists sort of competing for the story, like let's share the information about the story and compete, for the awards or whatever about the storytelling and how you tell the story and how you're doing the story, instead of about the information. Like, why not democratize all of the information to everyone? Because that's why we're doing what we do. So I've been really heartened to see a bit of a change in some of that for folks that are, interested in like, a lot of these stories that we work on are international stories and, always have like a transnational component. So being able to dial into some of these groups and these organizations that are saying like, hey, let's work together instead of against each other is really exciting. And also to be that person in your office, if you do work for a larger publication, to say, hey, like, let's collaborate, because we could still make this really good, and then just more people will see this and know about this issue. So yeah, let's collaborate.
Can you repeat the question?
Just what's the progress that you've seen in your particular coverage area since you've been at it, or on a beat that you've covered?
So some of the progress that I've seen, I would broaden it to environmental justice, because that's really kind of what I would call my beat on a global scale: environmental justice, racism, injustice. I did a story in a place called Laplace, Louisiana. It's a town, also kind of a border town of another town called Reserve, Louisiana. And they were towns that were largely black, largely populated by the descendants of freed slaves. and they recently won a judgment. Or rather, not a judgment. They got their case brought to the DOJ, and the DOJ was picking up an investigation based on a chemical plant that had been polluting their area for over 50 years. It's with a carcinogen known as chloroprene, and they've been fighting it for a long time, knowing that it had been causing cancer. There's a place called Cancer Alley, many of you may have heard of. This area is known for this reason, and Louisiana even has a tumor registry where people can go and register their tumors based on where they live. And if you look at this area, there's a very high spike of incidences of tumors and cancer. Well, the DOJ thought to pick it up. I reported this 5 years ago, but it was like the first time it had been reported nationally, and several publications, including ProPublica, have picked it up since. But they got this judgment, or got this DOJ investigation going, and then it just disappeared. It was going, the Biden administration made a big push about it, about environmental justice, and it disappeared. And the folks there on the ground are questioning why now. They had seen progress. They had a sympathetic ear at the EPA for environmental justice stories, and then it disappeared in the last almost a year now, May of last year. It kind of went cold. And no one has given any real hard answers why. I'm not on the story anymore. I've moved on, obviously, but the point that I want to make is the champions on the ground is what I have seen a change in. Those champions on the ground are aware of the threats, obviously, but they're also aware of the fight and what it takes for the fight. And these people hold on, and it seems like even in the face of that huge up and down, seeing their case get picked up by the Department of Justice in this very small town where they didn't have a voice, years ago, and then only for it to kind of fizzle out. It seems like they've dug their heels in, and I don't want to speak for them, but I do know that it shows you the might of the human spirit and the resilience of people who are facing pretty challenging odds when it comes to getting collective action just to breathe clearly and not worry that what they're breathing in is killing them. And same for the towns in Flint, Michigan. We're on the 10th anniversary of Flint, Michigan. And I see the same in the champions that I meet in places like Ghana. They are ready to fight and ready to find a solution that preserves their life, because at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure the world is livable for all of us. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chris. I wonder, as you guys are speaking, I think it could be easy for somebody in the audience, somebody who's live streaming, to feel like what you're covering are kind of very disparate topics. And I wonder, as you guys are talking and explaining your coverage, your type of journalism, where do you guys see the connections among what you all are doing? Like, where are the intersections? And Hillary, what you're covering with what Kara's covering with Chris, like, I'll throw it out to the group and see who bites. What you guys see?
I mean, I think we're all saying very similar things, but
Yes.
just in terms of the coverage, I mean, it's kind of what I was talking about, like everything, it all sort of comes together to a nexus, right? So like the same, the fishermen in Ghana, like they're being impacted. The creatures in the ocean that they're fishing are being impacted. Like there's just all these different levels of people and creatures and who are all, experiencing the sort of detrimental effects of climate change and years of sort of neglect and different policies. And so I think we need to recognize that the same, like we're all connected, right? Like, and the same things that are harming non-human species are also harming human species and vice versa. And I think there has really, for whatever reason, not been this recognition among the broader public, certainly in the global north. This seems like a much more sort of integral concept to a lot of indigenous groups. Like people understand that like we're all connected, and I feel like somehow in like Western culture that has not been, front and center, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it. But like,
Yes.
we are all connected, and if something is harming you, it's also harming non-human creatures, and if it's harming them, it's harming us. And so we need to really recognize like this, interconnectivity of all of us.
I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but even just saying like what's happening in Brazil can also be happening on your doorstep. The idea that somehow we are different because of some sort of geological boundaries is hilarious. Like, it's whoever came up with that. Good one. You're tricking everyone. But no, I mean, but this idea that like it couldn't happen to me, I think
Right.
that actually that time is gone now. I think the global South and like human rights and land defenders in the global South for a long time have been like, it's happening. But I think that actually folks in our geographical region are also feeling those effects by flooding or wildfires or whatever, and are actually able to have perhaps a little bit more compassion or understanding in terms of what folks have been dealing with in other places that once seemed very far to them. But sort of on a similar about the connectedness, I don't think that you, in the field of what we do, I don't think you necessarily need to be an environmental journalist to be able to touch on this work. That hasn't been like my beat for my career, but environmental reporting informs so much of the other reporting that I do. You can't talk about the effects of war without talking about what that looks like on the ground in terms of the environment that people are existing in. You can't talk about anything else without talking about the environment. So I think, like, again, not to speak to the only to the journalism students, but to the general public, like, we have an ability to talk about these things in a more integrated way very easily because it's everything in front of us.
Chris, were you going to add something too?
I don't have much to add. I just know that this is something that I see as a through line through all of us, which is, like Hillary said, the intersection of people and animals. We all are interacting with nature. Nature is no longer, a drive away. It's where we live. I mean, it never really was, right? But we have these segmented lives and segmented ways of thinking about things due to many reasons, but we are now faced head on with looking at why, seasons have changed the way they have. We could always point to that, but look at why you don't see as many butterflies, as many bees. The memories are also what is the through line for all of us, because every single person that we talk to, I'm sure, can tell you, oh, I remember when it used to be like this. I remember when my father taught me how to fish, and we would come up with, thousands and thousands of fish in one trip. Now I can't get that in a year. I think just our human condition and the condition of the humans we talk to is a major through line. And if we continue to tap into that, these stories will continue to be universal and hopefully have an impact.
And I would say, too, just on my particular beat, one thing, like the connectedness at this conference, we had a discussion about what different watersheds can learn from each other, thinking of things less with political boundaries and more with hydrologic or natural boundaries, and really kind of compare and contrast what's going on in India or China or the United States or Australia around water scarcity. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to learn about what's going on in different parts of the world and see how we can bring that back to communities here in the U.S.
Can I just add one more quick thing? Sorry, not to belabor this, but it just makes me think, I think that's partly how we got into this mess in the first place, right? Is just like thinking like, oh, well, I could do whatever I want right here because it's just right here. And that's not actually the way the planet works.
Nope.
Great. I've got a couple more, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. And a reminder, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand, and our producer will bring a note card over so you can write, and then we'll go to audience Q&A here in just a second. I had a question just kind of about, not necessarily even about environmental journalism, just about journalism in general. What do you feel like the general public doesn't totally understand about the change that's been going on in our field, maybe over the last few years. And what do you think the average news consumer should be thinking about when they're turning on the TV or scrolling on their phone or listening to the radio or reading a story? Like, what advice would you give as people are going out there in this crazy field of information that we're that we're faced with?
Yeah, totally. Well, it's a crazy time. I think most people know that. I think at least, I think maybe this is like a process sort of note, but I think a lot of people don't realize like kind of how much gets left on the cutting room floor, so to speak, of like every story is sort of like a delicate dance between you, your editor, your publisher, whatever. And there's a lot that gets kind of left out. There's a lot that gets trimmed down. Parts that you were really passionate about might get kind of subject to a hard word limit. And I think that's kind of tough sometimes because, you'll write something and you'll hear from sources and they'll be like, I really wish you did this one thing. And then you might be like, I really tried, and it wasn't really up to me. So I think like sometimes that process I think can get lost on people. Yeah, and just in general, like the whole news industry is going through a pretty significant contraction and then TBD after that. And so I think we're all kind of riding the wave of trying to figure out what the next new business model is that works for people and feels sustainable. And a real bright spot recently has been nonprofit newsrooms, which are kind of grant funded. Some of subscribers, some subscription models work despite what you might hear. Defector in New York is an outlet that works really well in that regard. But yeah, it's just that I feel like there's not actually a one-size-fits-all solution to how each different outlet moves through this next period. And so I think we're all anxiously waiting to figure that out.
No. Hillary?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of very few journalists that I've ever met in my entire career who weren't doing it because they believed incredibly strongly in like all the kinds of things that my colleagues up here are talking about. Like most journalists are not in it for the money. And so, journalists are doing this because they believe like desperately and passionately in the subjects that they're writing about and in the fact that people need to be informed about these things. And I think that journalists have just gotten such a bad name over the last decade or whatever for a million reasons that are probably the subject of a different panel. But I just wish that people would sort of understand that like journalists are like putting in just like endless crazy hours and so much blood, sweat, and tears to bring the stories to light that they feel like the public needs to know about. And without those stories and without being informed about these things, like honestly, I mean, our democracy would for sure fall apart, but lots of other bad things would happen too.
I mean, in the question about like what news consumers should know or could know is that like we want to engage with you. We are the public, and so are you. Like, let's talk. Yeah. But like we're so like we the monolith of journalists. We want to. Like we want to talk to people. This is what makes our stories happen. Like whistleblowers are not like, if you're sitting down and reading a story and you're like, I don't know, I live in this neighborhood and that's not how I see it. Like you have the power to be like, hello, journalist that wrote this story. This is how I see it. Do you want to talk more about this? Again, I think that sort of feeds into what Hillary was just saying about a functional democracy. Like, here we go. Like, this is the way that we can have conversations with folks that we might have not necessarily either been able to engage with before we did the story or during the story or who didn't know that we were doing it. So I encourage the public to reach out to journalists in a thoughtful and kind way, please, to say where we are getting it right or where we're getting it wrong, or to share a story. Like, and if we can't, share your story, we might be able to point you towards someone that can. We are a well-connected group of folks, so let us also help tell your stories.
I'll say just consider the source, look at who advertisers are. This is very kind of 101 journalism school here, you know. Look at who the advertisers are. What are their interests in telling stories, or rather funding the telling of stories. I like public media as well for that reason, because it's a democracy of dollars going to fund the journalism going on there. So usually a little less murky in terms of the ties that come along with the funding of that outfit. As you know, the decimation of newspapers is very well told, but the decimation of local television is also something that is probably not as widely told, mainly because if you look at a local broadcast, it doesn't look like much has changed, but if you listen to it, a lot of it has changed on a massive level, because there's only a handful of organizations and businesses that own the majority of local television stations. And coming from a place where I worked in TV, both on a national and a local level, that definitely makes a difference in terms of where you're going to spend your dollars to send a crew, where you're going to spend your dollars to set up a live shot, where you're going to go, whose story matters. And I don't know, I don't like to tell people or give advice, but I would just say consider the source.
Anyone else with like practical tips on like going out into the world and like trying to make sense of like now we've got like AI and disinformation and misinformation campaigns. It's like really daunting to try and figure out what the heck is actually going on in some of these large storylines that are facing our country and our world. So anybody with like practical tips of like you as news consumer, how do you like deal with that?
2 or more independent sources for a fact. Independent sources, you know.
And primary.
Primary.
Primary sources.
Wow,
Whatever.
primary,
go
and
primary.
independent.
Awesome.
Now you're really putting the sieve on that news there with the primary, independent, 2 source. You gotta find it.
If it stinks, it's probably rotten, right? Like if you open your fridge and like the milk smells bad, like you're probably not gonna drink it, right? Like you know, go with that sense as well. I don't know how practical that is, but don't drink rotten, stinky milk.
Yeah. I feel like if it's been forwarded on WhatsApp 7 times, like don't trust it, you know? Or like don't trust it immediately.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking earlier today about zombie statistics, which are these kind of statistics that just sort of make the rounds that have, like, you can't really trace them back to anything. So one thing to do is sort of look up a statistic if you don't think it sounds accurate, and try to trace it back to its source.
Great. All right, we're going to go to the audience questions because they're starting to pile up and they're making me nervous that we don't have enough time. So
we got it.
We've got one question from a student. It says, it seems like a lot of the news, there's so much negativity in topic matter. It causes people to stop listening or reading. How do we combat that? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Great question. There are actually magazines and digital subscribing magazines that actually their mission is to deliver positive news. That's not a solution for, I think, mainstream news, because the truth is that when you do put out a solutions-based piece of article or work, it's often not really read very much. So because we have the statistics on this, at least from in the world that I function in. So I think you can, sort of like diversify some of your outlets. But I totally sympathize with you, student, wherever you are, because it is really dire out there. But I think that we can also, as journalists, do a better job of introducing like solutions or ideas that aren't just like token solutions within stories, that don't just have to be like their own thing that no one apparently wants to read. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I remember years back pitching a story to an editor about like a nonprofit that was doing this really cool project, and the editor was like, well, why would I want to write about that? They're just like do-gooders. It was really shocking and depressing to hear that. I think that attitude has like definitely changed. There is a really big emphasis on what's called solutions journalism, which doesn't mean just kind of like only highlighting the positive, but kind of like what Kara's saying, like can we sort of report on what's going on and the problems, but also with an eye towards potential solutions.
Great. Next audience question. With the erosion of local newsrooms, i.e. budget, staff cuts, how do you perceive the effects on coverage of environmental issues and public awareness of them? Basically, is like environmental coverage the first to get cut? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yes, it is often, I would say, on a local level. But we have all these stopgap measures now, not all these, but we have these newsrooms that are dedicated to telling just these kinds of stories in a smaller location, or rather not in a particular geographic location. But what happens often is you miss the, you get all the big stories, but you miss those kind of little connecting stories. But environmental journalism, like what Hillary said, the interaction with your editor is, I think, still probably going on, because I would imagine a lot of the journalist students who come out want to tell these stories, and then they're met with this reality that the editors have been facing for the last 10, 20, 15 years of still keeping eyeballs and still getting growing viewership, and that negativity unfortunately wins out due to the nature of the system. And you've probably heard the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. And environment doesn't really bleed. I mean, you could figuratively say, yes, oil spills and things of that nature, but no, they...
But you were talking about the, you could talk about that. I like that there's like so many more, the rise of the nonprofit
Yes.
journalism space.
Yeah, and I was, even up to that point, I think like a lot of environmental stories are like inherently interdisciplinary. They're the result of like a policy change, choices we make, and so maybe that's a case for some hope that like we can get environmental stories told through a slightly different lens as local newsrooms shrink. But yeah, to sort of the nonprofit point, it's like, that feels great that there are specific outlets dedicated to these stories that operate on a like semi-local level, that have local correspondence, and that feels like kind of a good stopgap as other like public radio newsrooms or local outlets have been hollowed out, which is terrible.
If I could just put in a plug for Boulder's local nonprofit newsroom. If you are not currently a subscriber to the Boulder Reporting Lab, I would highly recommend it. It actually grew out of a Scripps Fellowship, and they are doing amazing, amazing coverage of all kinds of local issues, including a lot of environmental issues.
And highly collaborative. In my time at KUNC, we were a partner with Boulder Reporting Lab, and that really is kind of the future of journalism, is working together with scarce resources. This is a question kind of about science and science journalism. This person is basically talking about, that there's kind of this cultural warfare going on with a distrust of science and scientists. And they ask, are you essentially all science journalists? And how has this trend of, attacking science or scientific institutions, how has it affected your work in the field? And do you feel like it's kind of your duty to restore legitimacy of science? Anyone want to take a guess?
Hillary?
I mean, I definitely consider myself a science journalist. I am a card-carrying member of the National Association of Science Writers. It's hard. I mean, it is definitely hard. I don't know that I have an exact answer. I mean, I feel like it is, I feel I have some kind of like duty to try to explain science in a way that the public can understand, and try to contextualize science and sort of explain, ideas about what we know and what we don't know, and really just try to explain what is going on in ways that are not political, but really are just dealing with facts.
I want to just say I don't consider myself a science journalist per se, but I do consider journalism a form of a science in that we usually come into a story with a pitch, which is kind of our hypothesis, and then our job is to kind of suss out, like in the real world, how much that hypothesis meets the shoreline of reality, and where they meet, those are points that we want to talk about, and where they don't, we'll hopefully leave that out of the story. But the science that we are trying to translate is something that is usually very tangible, because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. Let me speak for myself. I wouldn't be talking about it, because when you're missing a certain amount of food or a certain species on your plate, that's something tangible, and you need to find answers out to that. If you can't go to a beach anymore because it's now a seawall, then there you go. You have a you have a science. That's science. And I think if we just keep hammering the point, like Hillary said, of the kind of contextualizing the science, I think people will get it if they're willing to. Now, that some things you can't do anything about, but.
What do you guys think are the dominant narratives around climate that need to be challenged or dismantled? Basically, like, to put it another way, what are like the general public thinking about climate change that you think they're getting wrong, potentially?
You stumped us.
Yeah. I mean, I'll take a quick stab at it. I mean, I think there's some, our future is not like set in stone yet. Like, we're not locked into a certain warming threshold or one of those like pathways from the IPCC report. So there's still a lot we can do to like prevent, kind of the worst catastrophic impacts. And I think maybe sometimes like that gets lost in some communication, but definitely not my area of expertise. So yeah, that would be what I would potentially say.
I would maybe try and answer. I'll take moderator's privilege to try and answer some of this. One thing that I hear all the time is that there's this kind of distinction between individual action and collective action, and you kind of get people who feel like, the collective action people like rag on the individual, like, and I don't think it has to be that way. Like, I think that if we're gonna like really make progress on dealing with climate change and the many of other issues that fall underneath it, it has to be like everything all at once. Like, it has to be individuals taking their own actions that then create like a broader sum of collective action. This is like, I keep referencing this conference. It's like so fresh in my brain in Philadelphia. But that was a focus there too. People feel like if it's all on individuals, that's like so difficult. But you can take individual actions in your own life, whether that's voting or making changes to your daily life, that end up adding up to a greater whole. Anyone else with? No? Okay. This is kind of a more practical question that's kind of interesting. So as journalists who are reporting in foreign countries, a lot of times you have to have a fixer or somebody who does work for you. Maybe somebody can just explain what a fixer is and how does that whole situation work? Yeah.
I would love to take this one. So this is a great place to eliminate the word fixer, as cool as it sounds. These people are often extremely highly trained local journalists that just don't happen to work for like a big international media outlet or a national outlet. No shade to the person that asked this question, because I've used the word fixer my whole career as well, but we are really trying to move towards like giving the name to these folks. Our colleagues, like they are the local journalist, and we are learning from them. So for when you're reporting out in the field in a place that you don't speak the language in, but you have been researching whatever, you're often assigned to this person who will serve as either a translator or someone who does fix up stuff. So like they'll fix up a meeting for you, or they'll be able to connect with someone that you're trying to get in touch with that you might not have the connections to. And these people are the bedrock of so much international reporting, and they are the unsung heroes. And I
remember and appreciate and love all of these people dearly because of the commitment that they have to telling the story no matter what. And it goes back to no matter if their name is on the byline, which it should be, or their name is credited or whatever. But these folks are the people that know the story inside and out in the place that you want to know the story inside and out from. And so they often serve as wonderful collaborators. And practically speaking, if you work for a big organization, you'll be tucked into a network that sort of already has these established folks. If you are a freelancer or a student that is looking to become a freelancer, a great place to start is to connect with some of these like larger organizations like the International Center for Journalism, and others like Bureau of Investigative Journalism or the Society of Environmental Journalists, who might be able to say, oh, hey, like you might want to check out this person, or look in local newspapers and see whose names you keep seeing come up in that reporting. Google Translate is great for that.
That's great.
Sorry, just to really drive home, these folks are like, they are stars in their own right and just are so underappreciated.
I didn't even know that term was on its way out. So
I
I'm glad. Thank you for
don't think it
explaining.
is, but I'm trying to kick it out
Okay,
the door.
it's a personal mission.
Yeah.
So this is kind of the traditional objectivity question. So this questioner says, it's an open secret that a majority of journalists in their private lives identify as progressive or liberal, and this has been weaponized against journalism and journalists by the right. What are some ways that you address this issue?
I just talk, so someone else can go.
Oh, well, I'll go. I've been quiet for a couple of questions. I used to work at CNN, and I started out, I told Hillary this earlier, or Kara this earlier, I started out as a tour guide. So when I was a tour guide at the CNN Center in Atlanta, if you ever went from 2008 to 2011, I may have been your tour guide. But I would often, we would be the only public interaction that people would have with the brand of CNN. And so we get all these people trying to prove a point on a $15 tour about how much there's a bias in the media. And while CNN is not the best example right now these days, I can't speak for it, but personally as a journalist, I took that time. I knew I wasn't going to stay a tour guide, obviously, but I took that time to gut check myself as a budding journalist at the time to say, I'll make sure that whatever I do, that I try to be as objective as possible. But then when you get in the newsroom, you start to see all the stories that don't make it. You get to see all the stories that don't, the pitch is taken, story produced, but then get cut for time or for breaking news. And you just make sure you try to fight for whatever it is that your voice can sustain. And in finding my voice as a journalist, specifically as a Asiatic black man in America, reporting for CNN domestic and the only black field producer for a while in the whole network of CNN, I had to make sure that our voice was lifted up, that our perspectives were heard, and it's not easy because people are already stereotyping you for how you got your job and how you got there and second guessing your credentials based on how and why you're there. And I just tried to do the most and excellent job that I could. And in that, was able to tell some stories that otherwise would not have been told had I not been in the appointed time and place to apply and earn the job that I ended up doing as a field producer. The story that I mentioned there out of Laplace, Louisiana, for instance, nobody was telling that story. And those people were very grateful for the fact that I stuck with it for as long as I did during an election year, during hurricane season, and all these other things that would take normally airtime away. We were able to get 8-9 minutes to tell that story on air. So it's objectivity in journalism, I believe, is somewhat of a sliding scale depending on your perspective. I would guess the same is true with women, with LGBTQ journalists who have for decades not seeing their voice, narrative, stories, faces represented, now is the time to do the representing. And you can call it liberal, you can call it progressive. I call it reporting on a place that reflects the place that we live in, and making sure that the tapestry is as varied as I see and as I move around the world.
Anyone else?
Yeah, can I just add one quick
yeah.
thing to that? I think it's really important as a reporter to really be aware of your biases and your point of view, and make sure that you're not sort of giving someone airtime or sort of coming down on one side just because the person is more likely to share your worldview. So as somebody who constantly writes about conservation, I have to sort of think, okay, well, I tend to maybe agree with this person or this group's sort of worldview, but does that necessarily mean that what they're telling me is true? And
Right.
so, you just have to kind of be have equal opportunity, everybody's kind of full of it, and I have to sort of, work doubly hard to sort of make sure that the people who share my worldview are really telling me something that's true.
Sean or Kara, is objectivity a myth? Does it exist?
Yeah, I think you guys gave wonderful answers. There's been a much needed reckoning around objectivity post Ferguson, post George Floyd, and Wesley Lowery in the Columbia Journalism Review wrote a series of great essays sort of about this, and
Yes.
echoing what you guys said. We should be aware of our biases, but it's sort of a myth that we should just be this blank box of non-feeling human being when we go out and report our stories, and we should be aware of our perspective. But for so long, objectivity meant erasing other people's perspectives, not actually presenting a holistic view of the world. I'm thinking all the phrases that we used to have to say before, officer involved shooting, stuff like that. It's not really helpful to actually have a layperson understand what just happened. And so, yeah, I could say a lot about this, but I'll end it there.
A lot.
Well, and we're out of time, so I want to thank our panelists for being up here and giving their perspectives, and I'd invite all of you to give them a round of applause.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah, no, you're actually stories.
And thank you all for being here.